Hello everyone, Dr. Alex Vasquez here with the next video in our program on human microbiome and dysbiosis in clinical disease. Today I am going to focus on solutions for dysbiosis in the location of the gastrointestinal tract. I'm sure that for most people, when they think of dysbiosis, they typically think of gastrointestinal dysbiosis, even though of course now we appreciate dysbiosis can occur in multiple locations even at the same time, even of course, in the same patient. And in those different locations, typically we encounter different microbes that each play their role in contributing to dysbiosis-induced disease. Gastrointestinal dysbiosis, I think, is arguably the most common type of dysbiosis. And that's because we have so many different influences on the microbiome of the gastrointestinal tract, such as exercise, nutritional supplementation, diet, of course, stress, and because we appreciate the clinical manifestations of gastrointestinal dysbiosis because the gut microbiome has the potential to have the greatest impact on human physiology and pathophysiology by sheer volume of the microbial population and the resulting microbial debris, which we talked about in video number 1, and also the microbial metabolites, which I've discussed several times now throughout the program, perhaps mostly in video number 2. And we'll talk about those more, both the microbial debris and the microbial metabolites, in the last video of the series, which will be on the gut-brain connection. Course objectives are going to be described here. Of course, the ultimate goal is enhanced clinical and intellectual acumen. Your participation in this presentation and study of the materials should enable you to define dysbiosis, eubiosis, and the associated terminology in immunology, microbiology, and pathophysiology, explain the role of multifocal polydysbiosis in metabolic and inflammatory disease, analyze, interpret laboratory results for significance and or lack thereof. And what I'm aiming for there is the judicious analysis of laboratory tests, not just going for what appears to be most obvious. Identify actionable alterations in microbial patterns and the associated phenotypes of dysbiosis-induced disease. Demonstrate, of course, skill in clinical reasoning. Implement treatment plans consistent with the 4 main components of evidence-based medicine, which I've reviewed previously. And we also need to have the ability to reject distractor data, non-actionable data, or inaccurate and bogus data as well. As many of you know, I have a strong interest in education, psychology, philosophy. This is a very interesting article that I read earlier this year in 2016. Very classic study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1999 by Kruger and Dunning. Some of you may be familiar with what is sometimes called the Kruger-Dunning effect or the Dunning-Kruger syndrome. Basically, when people are incompetent, they don't realize they're incompetent, but they think they're competent because they don't have enough self-awareness to judge otherwise. One of the interesting things about this particular study, which included several different experimental components, is that in the 4th part of the study, what they actually showed, or what they attempted to show, was that when people are better educated, or when they receive education, even a little bit, I think the study sample, for example, included 10 minutes of instruction. Even when people receive a little bit of instruction, they actually do become more competent and also more aware. At least some people do. People who are extremely incompetent do not improve even with more education. However, people who are marginally incompetent, kind of in the gray zone between competence and incompetence, those people actually do improve and they attain better ability to reflect as well. Also, in my personal interest with regard to education and cognitive intellectual abilities, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is pattern recognition. And in a book on a completely different topic, a book by Josh Kaufman titled The Personal MBA, he actually has a section in there that talks about pattern matching, very interesting in my opinion, and his description of the enhanced abilities that people have after they've gone through, for example, a lot of education or when they have lots of experience, What he states here, and I'll read it to you in just a moment, what he states here is that as people learn more and as people gain more experience, their ability to pattern recognize is enhanced, and that's why they have enhanced performance above and beyond their level of education. So, as I stated in the box on the right hand side, this is how learning anything always exceeds itself if applied with effort. And what I mean there is to state that learning information provides abilities beyond the cognitive acquisition of intellectual information. So when we learn things, we don't simply learn information. What we learn when we learn accurate information, especially if it's to a certain level of deep detail, I would imagine, what we actually gain is not simply information, but the ability to recognize patterns, and we can apply those patterns to other experiences in life and perform better in those situations as well, even though we may have learned something on a completely unrelated topic or a different subject. So let me just read to you what he said, which I found very interesting. The more accurate patterns you've learned, the more options you have when solving new problems. Pattern matching is one of the primary reasons experienced people tend to make better decisions than inexperienced people. They've learned more accurate patterns via their experience. Having a larger mental database to draw from is what gives experts their expertise. And then, secondarily, he says pattern matching is one of the foundational capabilities of our mind and how it works. The more accurate patterns you have stored in your memory, the more quickly and accurately you can respond to whatever life throws at you. So, some of you may find that interesting. Obviously, I did, which is why I added it to the presentation here. So let's move on and talk about solutions to gastrointestinal dysbiosis. This is my page of notices and disclosures. Everything, of course, is copyrighted. Some of it's protected by a trademark. All of this is educational information for clinicians. I have worked as a researcher and consultant lecturer for Biotics Research Corporation. Some of the treatments I describe might be considered off-label per FDA guidelines or definitions. So prescribing clinicians will have the ultimate responsibility in determining the appropriateness of drug prescribing per patient. We've been talking about different locations of dysbiosis, as you can see in this graphic, which we're going to relatively quickly bypass. I noticed maybe last year, I guess it was, in 2015, I heard that a supposed functional medicine expert was going around saying that we were all born sterile and that we later acquired the microbiome and ultimately, in some cases, dysbiosis. Actually, that's not true. And now we've got certainly plenty of data. I was reminded of that inaccurate statement when I saw some of these new reports, which is why I included it here. Nothing in the human body is sterile, and at no point in time are we as humans sterile or germ-free. So you can see the newer reports showing that the placenta has its own microbiome. And you can also see from scientific reports in August of 2016 the microbiome of aseptically collected human breast tissue in benign and malignant disease. The breast itself has its own microbiome. Breast milk has its own microbiome. Breast milk also transfers intact dietary proteins for that matter as well. But certainly we are never sterile. We always have a microbiome. So again, today we're going to focus on gastrointestinal dysbiosis. It is the most varied and quantitatively most important. So again, you've got pounds or kilograms of bacteria in your gut. You certainly don't have that quantity in your nasopharynx, genitourinary tract, or on your skin for that matter. So the potential impact of the gastrointestinal microbiome is massive, and that's why we see so many different clinical diseases associated with, causatively associated with, gastrointestinal dysbiosis. Of course, we've seen many of these concepts now come into kind of popular or public knowledge. Here's an article from 2015 in The Atlantic talking about gastrointestinal dysbiosis and how it can contribute to rheumatoid arthritis. You know, some of us were writing and reporting on this, maybe 12 years ago, 20 years ago. I published a rather important paper in 2006 that reviewed many of these concepts, but now we see that they are finally, 9 or 10 years later coming into public knowledge. This was another very impressive article from 2007, Is Rheumatoid Arthritis a Disease That Starts in the Intestine? A pilot study comparing elemental diet with oral prednisolone.